Hi, I'm Alana Hippensteel from Pharmacy Times. Joining me today is the CEO of US Pharmacopoeia, or USP, Ronald Piervincenzi, who is here today to discuss USP's history, the role of the pharmacist both in that history and in USP's work today, and USP's outlook on the future of pharmacy. This discussion also kicks off the start to a new video series Pharmacy Times and USP have created together to highlight USP's work to support the pharmacist over its 200-year history and discuss USP's perspective on timely and topical issues in the field. Ron, let's start with a little history about USP. When was it founded and why was it established as an organization?
Thank you, Alana. It's a real pleasure to be here. USP was founded because there were poor quality medicines being dumped on the shores of the US very early in the existence of the US at the time when there were really 13 states. And a lot of those poor quality medicines were coming from England. Some were famously, if you look at some historical documents, labeled good enough for the US or good enough for the colonies in some cases, literally said that on the label. And then that is what arose to say, hey, what if we had this thing? What if we had something that would define what good looks like for the US? And that was a big idea for two reasons. One, there had never been a national pharmacopoeia before anywhere in the world. And two, there wasn't much national in the US. Frankly, it was a loose confederation of states. And it was considered a big deal. There were 11 founders, three of whom were in or recently have been in US Congress, including a senator. And the founding was conducted in the U.S. Senate chamber to signify something that was national and of importance. It was, the symbolism was important and recognized at the time.
That is fascinating. Yeah, that is really interesting to get that insight into our history. Are there any notable moments or events from USP's 200-year history that you think might be of interest to our pharmacy audience in particular?
Yeah, well, I'll emphasize the first one. Um, the truth is, the first edition of USP in 1820, which was overseen by solely physicians, was not great. I have a copy of it back here. We're proud that it existed. We're not so much proud of its content. The second edition was much better. And the second edition is when the collaboration began, which is now 191 years, 191 years and counting. And that is between pharmacy and physicians in leadership of USP. So pharmacy from that moment forward became a big part, and over time, the bigger part, in fact, by a substantial amount of our backbone, part of our convention, permanent members. Every board chair for USP's board has been a pharmacist, well, always, including today. Susan Winkler sits as our chair. And so it began then. And I say it jokingly, but seriously, physicians alone were not in a position to be able to define what good medicine looks like. And they played a very big role, and they still do. But the pharmacy turned that around, and then over the next 50 years or so, evolved what was really an herbal recipe book in the very, very earliest days to something that's robust, scientific, and analytical.
Yeah, that's fascinating. How has USP changed as an organization? You've mentioned some of the ways in which it was kind of founded and structured from the beginning, but how has it changed as an organization over the past 200 years?
Yeah, most of the change has come in the structure, as you're describing. The scope has changed with ways that you would know, which is what did medicine look like in 1820? What does medicine look like today? That's I guess I'll say obvious or obvious to this audience. But structurally, it was a little less obvious. USP was only volunteer run for over 100 years, and all the work, and not just by leadership, which is still volunteer driven today, but all of the work, including laboratory and scientific work, was carried out by academics, pharmacists, and individuals within pharmaceutical companies in the industry, within their own labs, on their free time, on the weekends and in evenings. And that was actually quite effective for a long time, but it couldn't keep up with the pace of scientific advance and scale. And so in the mid 1900s, USP began to create, in addition, not instead of, but in addition to its volunteer base of scientific experts, also staff and laboratories and ongoing work. And that staff work has grown, whereas and in fact, the volunteer work has also grown, maybe not quite as quickly as the staff work.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Um, what has been the role of the pharmacist throughout USP's history?
So in our I'll give you two answers to that: in our governance and in our day-to-day. So in our governance, as I mentioned before, we have multiple slots, 3 slots on our board of trustees for pharmaceutical scientists, and they've been a combination of clinical pharmacists as well as more traditional, or I should say more modern versions of clinical of pharmaceutical sciences as applied, including our board chair. And then they are represented very strongly in our broad base of our expert committees, including our chairs as our expert committee members. So these are all volunteer scientists that set our standards. There are 500 altogether. And the third is our convention. So I know it gets confusing, but our convention, that's our makeup. So they are organizations who then have a representative, but our organizations, the largest contingent of our organizations are pharmacy organizations, national pharmacies, schools of pharmacy, etc. And that's the group that determines our long-term history, that is in charge of voting our board and our chairs in. So it's in charge of our governance and our long-term strategy. And so pharmacy is woven literally right into the fabric of all that we do, and who we are.
Yeah, yeah. And what is the role of the pharmacist in USP's work today? And how have hundreds of years of history working together helped to inform that
Yeah,
role?
I would like to share that there's sometimes things come and go, and they seem to fade out and they come back in. So we've seen in USP's history, if you look at medicine through our timeline, not through our lens, but our timeline, we've seen it go from customized for each patient, concocted in the office or in the pharmacy, through industrialization into large pharmaceutical companies run by pharmaceutical scientists and pharmacists. And that has continued to evolve, and pharmacy became a broad range, including everything from community pharmacies to clinical pharmacists, but also an evolution of pharmaceutical scientists into subspecialties. And so we think it's no longer the pharmaceutical sciences, but it's there. It got more specialized. But what's interesting is after that, today we see a return to some of the elements that we saw in the very earliest days. What is personalized medicine, or 3D printing of a tablet customized to your needs, your API, quantity, etc. Well, it looks a bit like the earliest days, and of course we apply labels like compounding that maybe mean something in one setting or another, but really think about it, we didn't move away so much, but we've kind of rediscovered the value of some of this. And I believe that that's why you see the role of the pharmacist coming into a prominence that it hasn't seen in quite some time.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely, the pandemic has helped to shine some light on that. And specifically, during the pandemic, how has USP worked with pharmacists to support their role in healthcare?
Well, the very first weeks when the pandemic was recognized, was declared, and also New York was unfortunately the world's hotspot, was one of the very first things that came about were shortages about, and not yet medicine, although that came later, but even just simple things like masks. We didn't have enough masks for pharmacists to use in their everyday practice, and also in compounding, which is incredibly important, especially in a pandemic, when that was one of the solutions we had for drug shortages. So we worked with pharmacists starting that day and right through today, through the last year, to tackle each of these very unique challenges, from personal protective equipment early on. We've more recently worked on the vaccine delivery, which is being delivered proudly by many pharmacists, including in this arm right here, twice, by a pharmacist that I very closely work with, and also in between are roles that pharmacy institutions are playing increasing roles around supply chain resiliency. And so this is about the broad supply chain of medicine, and the role that leaders in pharmacy and pharmacy purchasing organizations, et cetera, are playing to help make sure that they're helping mitigate the risks of drug shortages for their patients. We've been meeting with pharmacists in health systems, for example, who are trying to ask questions like, hey, how do I make decisions that will help secure better medicines? So think of that at the care level, the broad system level. It's truly been remarkable. I don't think that's an exaggeration.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, and how has the pandemic help to shape USP's work in the pharmacy space today, more broadly speaking?
It's helped reconnect us in broader ways. And that has started a dialogue, which, although, yes, it started here in the pandemic, it's connected us in ways that we're rediscovering some of what we can do to be helpful, some of our relevance that will change us going forward. And I think you could say, well, how could you discover something if you've been working together for 190 years, 201 years overall? And the answer is that sometimes that's one of the most important times to do that. Is that you have a moment to shake off the everyday, rhythm, and realize, hey, what can we do helping each other? And I use the vaccine toolkit as an example, without getting into the specifics, that wasn't the thing that the world ever needed before. So no one thought we needed it, of course. But that highlights says there are a lot of things that pharmacists are doing on the front lines of healthcare delivery where we could be partnering and doing more together. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, it's very exciting. It's very exciting for the future. And what is your outlook now on the future of pharmacy following the struggles of the past year?
So I'm bullish on not just pharmacy, but on the increasing role of pharmacy. But it's not without its challenges to step up. I see, and I think I see some of it more or less in through the pandemic lens. But just care, just being a part of care
Mhm.
delivery, has been a topic. It's become a reality. So it's very rare you can see something go from a discussion for so long and suddenly become such a vivid reality. How do you seize that moment? Because it's better for people around the world, and especially in the U.S. I think in other parts of the world we see pharmacy play a more prominent role in care than the U.S. And I think the U.S. has made steps that are kind of obvious in other places, maybe, but maybe we're less obvious here. But there's some pretty cutting edge things going on in digital medicine, in personalized medicine, as I mentioned earlier. And I'm not just talking about the actual manufacturing of medicines on the spot, but that's a care that only pharmacy is at a scale and close enough to the patients to be able to make that really work at scale. It's one thing to have 10,000 patients on a one medicine, but what if we have 500 different kinds of therapeutic solutions that are all being personalized for 300 million people? That's the plan. That's the plan that we're working towards. No one except pharmacy has the reach and the volume and the accessibility to make that work. So I'm excited for that, but it's quite looks quite different than how most pharmacists, interact with patients today.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is exciting. It is exciting, although it is different. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Dr. Pierre Vincenzi.
Thank you, Alana. It's been a pleasure.